sometimes not knowing what you are doing can be the best way to learn. We've heard so many ways that can be applied. We've heard fake it until you make it, which is not always a comfortable place to be. But then we also know that necessity is the mother of invention. So there's a story here that I'm setting up that will fall into what we're talking about with today's guest. Dr. Jim Salvucci is an author, keynote speaker, coach, and consultant. He served in higher education for 30 years before founding Guidance for Greatness, a consultancy that guides young bosses to become the next generation of great leaders. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. Great to see you.
Yes. So we're going to get into some different information than what maybe we have covered with some previous guests, but I want to start by something I saw on a video on your website. You mentioned that if leadership was easy, everyone would be a great leader. Sure. And so what I'd like to know, there's so much out there about leadership. What is the biggest misconception you see that many people have about leadership?
Yeah, that's actually an old video. I'd put it a little differently now. It's true. I mean, it's absolutely true. If leadership were easy, everybody would do it. But one of the things I've come to realize is there's all this leadership advice out there. It's very, very difficult to navigate. Frankly, most of it's good. I mean, there's a few things I might take issue with, but most of it's pretty good. And we make it overly complicated in terms of the conceptualization. In other words, conceptualizing what a good leader is, that's not hard. What's hard is being a leader, actually executing it and keeping it going. That's the hard part. That's the challenge, right? And that's the fun part too. But conceptualizing it, knowing all the rules and this and that, I actually boiled it down to 4. I took all that stuff and just boiled it down to 4 because the human brain can only handle 4 things at a time anyhow, as studies show. So, and I just say, and they're in order. I say, focus on your communication. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Focus on your character first, right? Who you are as a person. How you behave, by the way, is an important part of character. How you communicate, and listening is a big part of that. Then that you move on to being able to compromise, which is just give and take. Right? It's not necessarily 50-50, but there's always a give and take. It's very transactional. And it culminates in collaboration. You do those 4 things and you're well on your way to being a leader. You do that consistently, you're a leader.
And I heard you set that up. Those are 4 C's, so easy to remember.
The 4 C's of leadership success. Yep. That's what I call them. Yep.
All
it's
right.
one of my keynote speeches.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's good to know for those of you looking for a keynote speaker. I did hear Jim speak a couple weeks ago at an event, and he is a phenomenal speaker. He can weave a story like very few. So if you're looking for a keynote speaker, I'll give you a boost there, Jim.
Thanks. You too. I've heard you speak. You're wonderful.
Well, thank you. But something is you started out in education. I was in K through 12, but you were where we sent the people that finished our school. We sent them to you later in higher ed. So tell us a little bit about your background in higher ed and maybe some ways in which you were then pushed out of your comfort zone.
Yeah. So I was an English professor at a bunch of different schools. I spent a lot of time at a school outside of Baltimore called Stevenson University. And while I was there, I was a faculty leader. I've been a leader my whole life. I mean, I've been always thrust into leadership positions, not always, willingly. So talk about being outside your comfort zone. Even as a kid, I was thrust in a leadership position in Boy Scouts that I wasn't ready for. And I became a faculty leader, which is just always seems to happen with me. And I was asked to become a dean, the dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, which is great. Except for one thing, there was no School of Humanities and Social Sciences. So I had to found the school. And that was a little outside my comfort zone. Although pretty quickly I realized that's easy. It's just putting this with that. It's mechanics, right? Nuts and bolts, management stuff. Easy. The hard thing is getting it up and running and keeping it running, right? How do you do that? And that requires leadership. I didn't really have any guidance. My boss was a boss, and I make a distinction between bosses and leaders. His boss, the president, was most certainly a boss. And you heard a little about him in my talk from a few weeks ago. He was ridiculous. And, so I had no mentorship, no guidance, no training. I looked at my peers. They were all over the place. I thought, well, let me imitate them for a while. That wasn't good. And I realized at some point that I just needed to up my leadership game. I'd been a leader. I'd been a gut leader, right? I was intuitive. I was good at it. I didn't hurt people. I was actually pretty good. But the stakes were much, much higher now. And I needed to be able to, just lead in a really profoundly different way. So I started studying leadership. I treated it like a discipline. I moved from English as my discipline to leadership as my second discipline. I read books. I went to trainings, workshops, talked to people, did this, did that, got certifications, blah, blah, blah. And I'm an empiricist at heart. So I tried a lot of things, experiments, we'll say, learned from my mistakes, discovered I could draw lessons from other people's failures and from systemic failures, something I call learning from the negative paradigm. I talk about that a lot. Don't ignore other people's failures. Look at what happened and figure out how to do better. And since I was surrounded by that, that was very helpful. And, eventually I moved on, was a provost at a couple of different other institutions, which is, a top vice president, number 2 to the president. And then I left higher ed, where I was challenged every inch of the way, where I was moved out of my comfort zone every inch of the way. One of my first really great leadership insights was that every leadership problem is a teaching problem. In other words, the same skills, the same methodologies, the same approaches, the same attitudes, the same mindsets that you use as a teacher are precisely the ones you use as a leader. And a lot of teachers are very resistant to this idea, by the way, which is a shame. And so I was applying my teacher skills as a leader. Teachers, in order to be effective, need to learn, right? Great teachers are great learners. Great leaders are great learners. How do you learn? You learn by being outside your comfort zone. You don't generally learn within your comfort zone. You need to push yourself. So I was constantly pushing myself. I was being pushed by my positions. I was often in extremely dysfunctional circumstances, trying to carve out a space for my people to thrive in, right? So the faculty and the staff who were under me, so that they could thrive, creating like almost a bubble around them. So I was constantly uncomfortable doing that. I used to refer to myself as a human heat shield. I was constantly getting blasted from above, presidents and whatever, protecting people and letting them become the best people they could be. So yeah, I was constantly learning, constantly pushing myself to be outside my comfort zone, but constantly pushed there in a variety of ways.
So there's a couple things you said in there I'd like to pick up on. You said teachers get uncomfortable, like they didn't like the thought of becoming leaders. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Well, I would argue a good teacher is already a leader, right? It's not becoming, they're literally the same. I one time did an experiment with a presentation. I was actually consulting with a school, a private school, talking to the administrators, and I had them, I gave them a prompt where they had to picture a great leader, a great teacher. And then I asked them to collaboratively come up with a list of qualities, of that person, what made that person a great teacher. And then I gave them a similar prompt for a great leader, and they started the list and they got halfway through and they go, oh my God, it's the same list. They're literally the same. It's just a matter of circumstance and title. It's nothing, it's just superficials. There's really no difference. And I think teachers are resistant to that idea because in this country, we don't, we think highly of leaders in the abstract, mind you, right? Mm-hmm. And we think very negatively of teachers. And I think, there's a stereotype threat involved. And I can explain how that works. But I think teachers imbibe that, right? Just like we all imbibe the stereotypes that are around us. And so they kind of, it's almost like an inferiority complex. Like, I can't be a leader. Okay, I lead third graders. What's that? No. Mm-hmm. It's more complicated than that and more profound than that. And I think if more teachers thought of themselves as leaders and more leaders thought of themselves as teachers, we'd live in a much happier world.
Yes. And when you think, though, we're entrusting these teachers to the next generation of leaders that are coming up. Like, this is an enormously large responsibility that we have. So, yeah, that's really interesting and definitely something worth pursuing, looking into further. Not on this podcast. We've got other things we want to talk about. But you also mentioned that bosses aren't necessarily leaders, and many leaders are not bosses. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Easy. I talk about this one all the time. I don't use the word boss and leader interchangeably. I think those two words really have nothing to do with each other. And I think it's a great shame that we've kind of conflated the two. Bosses are, frankly, rarely leaders. Managers are rarely leaders. And even few are great leaders. Even fewer are great leaders. Okay. Many, many leaders are not bosses. Even great leaders who they'll never be a boss. Right. So, those two words really have nothing to do with each other. Boss is a position and an attitude, and I make a bit of a distinction between boss and manager. A manager is sort of a benign boss, but not necessarily a leader. But both of those are titles. Leader is something else altogether. We think of, and one of the gripes I have about a lot of leadership writing is they go out and they find the most successful leaders in business and blah, 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 blah. And a lot of those people, when you really boil it down, they're not really leaders. They're bosses, right? We make that, but because they're in the top position, we say, oh, they're a leader. And they might have found success, but at a very high cost. And if you talk to their people, they might have a different opinion. And so it's kind of, I think we make a big mistake by mixing up those two words and using them interchangeably.
And I have to wonder if it all goes back to kindergarten when you get to be the line leader, like you're at the top, right? So maybe that's the problem. It's the org chart that we confuse the highest position, or maybe the one with the most responsibility, as the leader. But those could be two very different things, as you mentioned. So, Jim, you were in education for quite a while, and then you saw an opportunity to go into the business world. What led you there? And what's the big problem you're trying to solve when you get there?
Yeah. So, it was as these things often are, it was a confluence of a number of things. I was kind of on the presidential track. I was headed to be a president. I was beginning to have some consternation about that idea because I would be a very different president, and a lot of boards will not abide a different president. I had a friend who became the president of a very elite school in Pennsylvania, and she was a different kind of president, and the board resented her terribly. So I saw that example, and I saw plenty of other presidents who just conformed, right? They're just about themselves. And you see this playing out nationally, and I can talk about that as well. But, so I left my position. I was a provost. I left my position, not willingly. It was a big conflict I had with the president. And it happened to be just before the COVID lockdowns, by coincidence, which spared me that bullet. I was very happy not to be involved in that debacle, which, by the way, was largely avoidable. And from the education standpoint. And I decided, well, what do I want to do? And I was originally applying for jobs, and I had interviews, but the interviews they would interview me, say, oh, we'll get back to you. And then they would just be radio silence because we're too busy dealing with COVID. And it's like, really? HR is busy dealing with what exactly? Nobody's even on campus. They were just using it, as higher ed often does, as an excuse to not do what needs to be done. And I realized, I just don't want to be involved in this. And I called up the place I had an interview. I said, I'm withdrawing my name. And I just left higher ed unceremoniously. And said, well, what do I want to do? One of the things I loved about being an administrator, and I loved being an administrator, one of the things I loved about it was I got to work with young people and help them become great leaders. So I mentored them. I coached them. I worked with them. I gave them examples. I put them in interesting positions so that they would have to figure things out, gave them lots of autonomy, help them grow. I loved doing that. Because what leaders do, just like teachers, is they beget other leaders. Good teachers beget other teachers, right? Good leaders beget other leaders. So I decided that's what I want to do. So I started looking into how to set up a business and whatnot. I had no idea, having never done anything like it. I mean, I was entrepreneurial in the sense that I founded a school, but very different type of entrepreneurship. Nobody in my family was an entrepreneur. I had no examples. It was during COVID, so there were a number of strictures. So I've had a number of stops and restarts and this and that, but now I've moved on to where I'm much more comfortable with what I'm doing. I'm doing coaching, but I'm really beginning to emphasize my speaking and my writing.
Mm-hmm. So when you're looking to work with corporations or to come on as a speaker for a group, what is the takeaway that you want them to have after hearing you? What is the impact you'd like to have after working with them?
Yeah, there's usually a number. It's rarely just one.
Sure.
But it's, and it depends on what they're asking me to do. But, really, I think what I try to do is what I used to do as a teacher, which is try to break their brains as much as possible and just deliver as much stuff as I can to get them to really think about leadership in a different way. Because people, most leadership advice is pretty much the same, and it shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. People hear the same things, and I try to, and I'm big on not, and this goes back to learning from the negative paradigm. It isn't just here's what you do. It's also here's what you don't do. And a lot of people don't hear that message. And I've had, like I talked about the president of the one school I was at, he considered himself a great leader. Sorry, I can't say that without giggling. And, he would talk about all the time and read leadership books and give the deans and the vice presidents leadership books and talk about it, blah, 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 blah. And he would do these very superficial leadership things that he read about. But then his behavior was horrible, right? Because none of these books said, don't do this thing. Mm-hmm. One of the first leadership books I read, I just read it on a lark. I heard about it and I thought, oh, that seems clever. Was actually called, this is the title. It's by a Stanford researcher, a business professor named Robert Sutton, pretty well-known guy. And the title is The No Asshole Rule. And I read this book and it blew me away. And it was about how not to be a jerk and don't tolerate jerks, right? Don't let them into your workplace. And it was, it was backed by research. It wasn't just him riffing or anything like that. It was actually a very well put together book and a great argument. And that book had a profound effect on me and really put me in that mode of like, what shouldn't you do, right? Not just what do you do, but what shouldn't you do? And I think a lot of leadership advice doesn't delve into that. And I always try to get people to think about those things.
Yeah, and I think that's really smart. I use that in my business as well when I work with clients, is to know where you're going. Sometimes it's really good to clear out where you don't want to go. Mm-hmm. Like get that out of the realm. Don't make that, it's a distraction. Get it out there and understand, okay, what's left. And so if we're reading leadership books and we're ignoring the rest of who we are, that's going to get in the way. It's definitely going to be a problem.
Yep.
Yeah, of doing that. So, I know both Jim, you and I have made that leap from education to entrepreneurs in the business world. And they are, when I say world, they're not even two different worlds. They're two different universes sometimes. And I believe that it's very difficult for people in education to understand business. I know when I started, I didn't know what much of the vocabulary was around business. And I believe people who are in business have a very difficult time outside the fact that they were a student at one point. Their perspective of what education is as a student is very different than what it is as reality. What would you like business to understand about how higher ed runs? The loaded question I've teed up for you.
Very loaded. It's a freight train full of stuff there.
Yes.
You hit on a number of the things too. If there were one thing that I would say is I would hope that business understood that universities, higher ed, thinks that what business needs is technical knowledge. And you see this all the time. And, community colleges are held up as a model of this. And community colleges in some states are called technical colleges. And that's what they're there for. But that's a different model than other types of schools. And I'm not saying it's bad or good. It's just different. But when you do a traditional 4-year degree, it's supposed to actually transform you. And we say that all the time. Like, look at every mission statement. They say some version of that, right? But we do absolutely nothing in any formal way to transform people, right? And then the flip side of that, and everything we do is transactional. I used to talk to students about this all the time, which would freak them out. Cause they were like, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. We're asking you to do all these transactional things, get grades, do assignments, all this other stuff, get a degree. But we ask you to but at the same time, we're pressuring you to transform, but we're not doing anything to help you with that or reward you for that. And they would flip out over that. Cause they're like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm experiencing. The same time, businesses are asking for two things, but they're not being totally honest with themselves about it. They want this technical training. They say it all the time. But then when they're actually surveyed, and every 2 years, the Association of American Colleges and University does a survey of businesses saying, what do you want out of undergraduates? And invariably, the top 10 things that they list, top 10, are what we call soft skills.
Yes.
Okay. And that's the transformational part. Okay. And and one of my sayings is soft skills are the hardest skills of all, right? They're the hardest to understand and to master and to put in place and to keep doing. They're the most difficult ones. And by the way, they're the ones that are key to leadership. The technical skills, the businesses always say, well, we can teach them most of that. And what they're learning in the colleges and how we do it anyhow. We do our spreadsheets differently or whatever. And, and so we've created this sort of duality where the businesses don't really know what's going on with the colleges and the colleges don't really know what's going on with the business, even though they talk all the time and they pretend they know. It's exactly the same thing with high schools and colleges. They don't know what, the high schools have no idea what colleges want and colleges have no idea what the high schools are doing. I actually one time when I was at a small town in Iowa where my university was, and I actually took my math and English faculty to the high school to meet with math and English teachers. You would have thought a bomb dropped. Like, this is unheard of. And they had a lot of the same dilemmas and complaints and whatnot. It was very interesting, but it's the same thing going on with business. There's a disconnect. I think part of it is businesses need to figure out what they really want from universities and express it and stop saying things like, oh, we don't want liberal arts majors when the CEO is a liberal arts major. Okay. Having the CEO say, oh, I don't want anthropology majors when the CEO was an anthropology major, right? Figure that one out. And the person who never really rises above was in some technical major where everything they learned has been outstripped by progress.
Yes. And I think too, we rely so much on how we used to educate and how business used to be. But if you're looking at what our workers need, is they need those soft skills. So how do you train for that? And it's not transactional. It is relational. It is transformational. That's where those come from. And if we're not setting them up to practice those or to even recognize them and the value in them, then what hope do we have?
Yeah. I used to, orientation for students, I'd always say, in 10 years from now, many of you, maybe even most of you, will be in fields that do not currently exist.
Yes.
How do you train for a field that it doesn't exist? And frankly, the way is through the liberal arts approach that's pretty unique to the U.S., which a lot of people don't realize again. You say, oh, in Europe, you can get a degree in 3 years. And it's like, and it's almost free. And it's like, well, first off, it's heavily subsidized. That's why it's almost free. It's not like they're doing something magical, where it used to be here too. But also they track their students earlier on in high school. So the people who aren't college ready or, they track them, they get them out, they weed them out, put them into trades, and everybody else gets sort of the liberal arts thing in high school. We do that in college, and we're open to anyone who can get in. Very different model.
Yeah, it is very different. And, I can remember being in a K through 12 schools, which, by the way, was a college preparatory school, and saying we need to prepare our students for when they get to college, but what will college look like by the time they get there? And if you look at now, colleges and higher ed, they're floundering a little bit. They look more like resorts than they do learning institutions, many of them. And they're in a race to attract students who are full pay students. They're incentivizing their college admission directors on who can you admit that will matriculate in 4 years. And so we're looking, college completion rates are changing. Students are starting and stopping. They're having gap years. They're transferring and they're dropping off hours. There's a lot of disruption in higher ed, as there is in a lot of industries right now. But I would imagine 30 years in higher ed, for you to be so ignited to do something about leadership, Jim. What is either a trend or maybe even a story you saw that broke your heart about, if that person could only have been a better leader, or if we could teach our students to be better leaders? Do you have something, maybe a quick story for us?
It's going to take me about 10 minutes to come up with, to weed out read it down to one. So, I mean, there are a gazillion stories. I mean,
Sure.
Watching. Okay, so I'll go back to the university I was at outside of Baltimore because I spent so much time there and I got to see a lot of evolution there. We were actually doing amazing things. We're just a small university. Originally, we were called Village Woolley College. It used to be a Catholic women's college back in the 60s, and it hadn't been that in decades, right? And so, and we changed the name to Stevenson because it was still perceived as a Catholic women's college, and Stevenson's very hyper masculine, Stephen's son. And, we also put in football to get rid of our old image. But, the president there was a lousy leader, but he did have a vision. And when he first started there, I came the year after he started. He was there for a long time. He started looking at what our strengths were. And one of our strengths was that we had always been really good at career training. So we were, what used to be called a comprehensive university. We had a liberal arts core, but most of our majors were in things like nursing and business. He came up with this idea he called career architecture. And the idea was that we would scale our programs onto helping guide students into a career, not a job, a career. This was actually pretty brilliant, and it took a while. And we pushed it in a variety of ways. He did some pretty innovative things. Like at one point we brought in the design firm IDEO. We brought them on campus, which was amazing to work with them. I got to work with them a little bit. We learned their techniques and whatnot. Really cool stuff. I've used it a million times. And we actually worked on how we were going to shape this. And they boiled our career architecture down to 3 things. And they were on campus for weeks and did all kinds of work. I mean, it was great what they did. It was fabulous. And then that was turned over to an administrator who immediately put it in a file drawer and forgot about it. Left it. And all of a sudden you just started seeing it, like all this started breaking down because part of it was, frankly, the president was all about his ego. This was a lot of heavy lifting. He had done enough heavy lifting. He was done. He'd rather go enjoy the perks of being a president. And I'm being pretty harsh here, but I'm holding back a lot because I saw this very up close and personal. I was a dean by then. And, they ended up not doing anything with it. And then eventually they pushed that woman out of that position. They were always moving her around because she was frankly incompetent, but they would never fire her. That's a typical higher ed thing. Give her top positions and then she would blow it and then they move her on and say, "Oh, can you believe she blew it?" And they hired a fabulous professional to replace her. It was actually ran our career services, which was very robust. And this woman came in and found this thing literally in a file drawer, this IDEO stuff, and her head exploded. She said, what is, she said, this is amazing. And so she brought it to the deans and said, we got to do this. And I was very big on, yes, we do. And at the time, the provost was as well. But we never really, it never really caught on the way it should have because we lacked that presidential leadership. The provost got distracted by other things. His favorite dean hated the idea of career architecture because she didn't like anything that moved her outside her comfort zone. And she had great influence over him, and he shifted away from that. And in the meantime, I had been an English professor. Well, I actually started a reform in the English department, even though I wasn't the chair, of trying to get us to rethink English. Because English is, I'm sorry, I'm going on very long about this, a lot of inside baseball. But English is a very content-driven curriculum, right? It's all about read this, read that. Everyone should read Shakespeare, that kind of thing, which is not a great way to educate people. And so I started getting us to focus on what objectives are we going to get out of a course? What skills are the students going to develop through our program? And from there, by the time I became a dean, a new chair had taken over the department. He was on board with this idea and they started reforming their curriculum. We actually had a skills-based, career-focused English curriculum.
That's amazing.
It was probably unique in the United States. There was one other school that claimed to have something similar. I looked at it. No. We actually, one of our courses was Design Your Career, it was called. And it was a junior level course. And our English major required an internship. And it was about how to do your resume, how to interview. We did mock interviews. Plus it had some English curriculum in it. And so it was very, this was a very sophisticated attempt to try to bridge that gap between the liberal arts and this idea of career prep without undermining. They were still reading literature, right? They were still doing all the same stuff English majors do. It was quite rigorous. But at the same time, they were doing this other stuff and they're having this other attitude. And that all got just kind of, they were doing it. And as far as I know, they're still doing it. But that all kind of got just pushed into the closet. It was just in the way. Admissions didn't care. They weren't pushing this idea. Oh, we don't get enough English majors. Like, well, because you don't promote English. Well, we don't promote English because we don't get enough English majors. Think about that.
Yeah.
Genius. Yes. So we, and that just got suppressed. We tried to present it. We were told by some outside folks, you have got to go to conferences and present this. This is unbelievable. And these were pretty well-known, experts. And every time we applied to conferences, we were rebuffed. It was extraordinary. Nobody cared. And that tells you something.
Yeah.
It was really too radical.
Yes. Yeah. And I think too, while you're talking about education, many of these things do still apply in business. You'll have a leader that if they are not on board with an idea, if it is not aligning with the vision and they're not willing to champion it, you can take that file and put it in a drawer and bury it, even though you may have some support for it, because people are looking at the top of the org chart. What is the culture we want to create? What are some of the maybe hidden agendas or self-promotion that goes into it? This is not only to the education field that you saw, but you also saw it in, we can, pretty much go to any industry and find this type of thing. But Jim, I want to really talk about, we both moved from education to entrepreneurship. And I've been on a path over the last several episodes talking about reinventing ourselves. When you are in one career and one industry and make the intentional choice to move to one that you've never done before, there are some surprises along the way. I'd be curious to find out from you, what have been some of the big surprises as you've navigated the path of entrepreneurship?
Starting a business is very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. You get tons of advice, some of it good, some of it bad, some of it good for a time, and then it kind of sours. A lot of people love to share what they did. And then you discovered, well, that worked for them because of, that sort of suited their personality. Or, and this is very common, I don't know if you found the same thing, but a lot of times people are giving you advice about do this thing, you got to do this thing, and you look into it and you find out That died 2 years ago. Like that doesn't work anymore. Like everybody tried to do that and now died. And yeah, it worked for you. So sorting through that, and there's no, I didn't really have any guidance. So I didn't have any clear way of navigating that. And it wasn't until I started hiring coaches and getting into masterminds and things like that, where I started really learning, what it is to be an entrepreneur, which I'm still very much learning.
Well, I'm a little bit further along the road than you are, and I will tell you, you will always be learning on that.
Sure.
Always be learning with that. And I saw a quote that said, "No one ever said it was going to be easy, but I didn't know it would be so hard."
Yeah.
And I think that is a great way to describe starting your own business. We go from an industry where we're an expert, we're often well respected for what we've been able to do or what we've been able to achieve or accomplish. And then all of a sudden you're knocked back down, so to speak, to having to learn all the things, having to wear all the hats when you start out to figure out what hats do I want to keep on and what hats do I want to hire out. So I think those are some really very interesting things. But I do want to pick up on what you said is, if you as a listener are wondering about this, is be careful of gurus who say you have to do it this way, right? Because Jim, as you spoke about and really did a nice job of, it worked for them, or it may have worked 2 years ago. And this is why I'm so passionate about knowing who you are, is what's going to work for you. Mm-hmm. And so, Jim and I are actually in a mastermind together. And so we learn not only from each other, we learn from the other people in the group. And so that is one of the benefits of finding people to surround yourselves with. I think that's been a big lesson for me that will help me grow. And speaking of growing, I want to also note that you are a certified Tiny Habits coach.
Yes.
So I'm curious, for those people who don't know what tiny habits are, could you explain what that is and how that might be able to be used in developing leadership?
Yeah. So tiny habits is a process, a concept, however you want to think of it, developed by B.J. Fogg, who's a Stanford behavior researcher. It is a brilliant approach to behavior change. And it consists of, I'll just give you in a nutshell very quickly. I can go on for an hour about this, but, so BJ came up with what we call the Fogg behavioral model, which is breaking down behavior into 3 components, all behavior, literally every behavior we have. The first one is your motivation, whether you want to do it or not. The second is your ability. How hard is it to do it, or how easy is it to do it? And then the third one is a prompt, some sort of trigger, something that gets you to do it. And one of BJ's great insights was that motivation, when we try to change our behavior, change our habits, we often focus on motivation. And motivation comes and goes, right? It fluctuates wildly. I always use the example of, in January, the gym is full. In February, the gym is empty. People lost their motivation. And they're all beating themselves up, by the way, over that fact, right? That they lost their motivation. And that's just a shame, because motivation does fluctuate and you can't count on it. Nobody's motivated 100% of the time in exactly the same way. So his thought was, instead of playing with the motivation, why don't we play with the ability to do it? What if we made it so ridiculously easy to do that it couldn't possibly fail, right? So a great example is like doing push-ups. Right? Some people say, I'm going to do 100 push-ups a day. Okay. Well, where do you start? Well, start with 1, right? Create a habit around doing 1 push-up. And if you do that 1, great. If you do more, better. But if you do the 1, great. And then, what happens is you're planting a seed, and that will grow, and it'll tend to grow into 1. So I use push-ups as an example because I did that. I created what we call a tiny habit recipe around doing push-ups. I think I started with 2. And it was I wasn't very motivated, but 2 push-ups, I could do 4 push-ups. Got on the floor, do 2 push-ups. And then it became 5. And then it became 10. Next thing I know, I was doing 30 at a time. And I was doing at least 120 a day. And I'm not like a workout guy, believe me. And so, this was like this is a big thing for me. Then I hurt my shoulder due to something else and I haven't been able to do it. Now I do planks, but, I'm hoping my shoulder will get better so I go back to doing push-ups because I now miss it because it became a habit.
Yes.
The other big innovation that BJ came up with, and this is really important, is we do not form habits because of a specific amount of time, right? You hear about 20 days new habit, 22 days new habit, 6 months, 9 months, whatever. The reason there's so many is because they're not true. There's no scientific basis for that. What he discovered scientifically is that what locks habits in are emotions, good, bad, or indifferent, right? Emotions lock them in. You can form a habit in an instant. And it doesn't take any time at all. And you have formed habits in an instant. So every habit you have, there was some original emotion behind it that locked it in. And so in Tiny Habits, what we do is we try to celebrate. So when I do those 2 push-ups, I would celebrate, feel the emotion. He calls it shine, the emotion of success, right? Celebrate it, feel really good about it. And Americans aren't real good at celebration. So that takes a little skill too. And so I had to learn how to celebrate. And then that locks it in. And you suddenly find yourself wanting to do it. Your motivation kind of becomes it's a habit, right? Like any habit, you just want to do it. So those are the basics. There's a lot more to it. But I suggest that people go to tinyhabits.com or check out BJ's book, Tiny Habits, to learn more.
Or call you. You're a Tiny Habits certified coach.
Or call
you can
me.
help them with that.
Or call me. I use it. I use it in my practice. I give my clients Tiny Habits. And I have a free resource online that actually employs Tiny Habits.
Okay, that's wonderful. So, you've got so much knowledge to share, Jim. I know you're a writer. Where can we find more information on you?
So the most basic thing is to go to my website, which is guidanceforgreatness.com. That's my company, Guidance for Greatness. Also, I can be found on LinkedIn, and I have a blog/podcast where I write an essay every week and then I read it aloud because some people like to hear it. And that is on Substack at jimsalvucci.substack.com. It's called On Leading with Greatness. You can also find it on any podcast platform, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. And I post it as a newsletter on LinkedIn under On Leading with Greatness. So it's pretty easy to find.
All right. So lots of resources for people. And Jim, I really love how you saw a problem and have used your passions to equip people with the insights and the tools to address it. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Lisa.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So be sure to check out Jim's resources for more on leadership and reach out to him for a conversation. All of those links we'll make sure that we put in the show notes. And for the audience today, do you see a wrong that you can do something about? Or do you feel a call in your heart that you were made for more? This is your passion rising up, and follow it until you reach the end of it. Because what you're going to find is it's going to lead you back to purpose, which is knowing how to use your gifts in the world. When you know who you are and can share it with the world is when you become that personal brand of integrity that leads you on the path to becoming your legendary self. Thanks so much.